He may even identify himself with it and believe that he is what he appears to be.
Welcome to the NCE Study Guide. I created this study guide using ChatGPT and Notebook LM. So think of these modules as AI-powered audio flashcards. Each one of these 20 modules contains 10 mock questions representing the kind of questions that you might encounter on the National Counseling Exam. I created this primarily for myself, and I decided to make these available to anyone else who might benefit from this kind of study aid. But please note, while I have done my best to ensure that these modules align with NCE content, I encourage you to cross-reference them with trusted study guides and resources for the most accurate preparation. These modules are not affiliated with or endorsed by the NBCC or any official licensing board. And today I'm introducing a new case study module. Now, as you may already know, I took the NCE and I passed it a few weeks ago, but I learned so much from putting these modules together, and I enjoy seeing the downloads increase and hearing from listeners who reach out. So I've decided to take this case study approach to kind of bridge that gap between prepping for the NCE and really getting started as a mental health care professional in the field, really understanding the ethics and the different modalities and the interventions and how would I do a diagnosis for certain situations. So that's what you're going to be hearing in these case study modules. And I also want to remind you that I'm putting together a grassroots study group for anyone who is looking for some real life person interaction as you prep for the NCE, not just these AI puppet shows. So if you're interested, email me at ncestudyguide@gmail.com. So, with no further ado, here are your AI study buddies from Notebook LM. Enjoy.
Nice to be in orbit.
Welcome everyone to this deep dive. We're focusing on NCE preparation today, specifically digging into Case Study Module 9 of 10 from the NCE Study Guide.
Yeah, our plan is to really break down this case, pull out those key insights that you'll find helpful for the NCE itself.
Right. Think of it as a way to see these core counseling concepts, but like in action. We'll look at the ethics, assessment angles, the theories behind the work, and potential interventions for this specific scenario.
Exactly. We want to help you think through these cases the way the exam expects you to. And maybe we should mention where this comes from, the NCE Study Guide.
Good point. It's a resource put together by Glenn Osland. He actually just went through the NCE process himself, passed it, so he knows what it's like.
And he's got an interesting background, master's degrees in folklore and clinical mental health counseling. Plus, he's been podcasting since, 2010?
Yeah, quite a while. And his whole motivation for creating these modules was basically his own study experience. He wanted stuff that wasn't just research-backed, but, really practical, stuff that sticks.
And the way he puts them together is pretty unique. He uses ChatGPT for drafting and sort of deep dives into the theory and ethics.
Right, gets the foundation down.
Then he organizes it all in Google Docs and then uses this other AI tool, Notebook LM, to synthesize everything. It helps him explore it from different angles, almost like having an AI study buddy to bounce ideas off of.
He calls it his AI puppet show. The idea is to create this dialogue-rich way of learning that mimics the critical thinking you need for the NCE. It gets you interacting with the material, not just reading it.
Mm-hmm. And for folks who like studying together, Glenn also runs a weekly study group just for listeners.
Oh yeah, how do people find out about that?
They can just email him at ncestudyguide@gmail.com. He'll send the details on how to join.
Great. And hey, if you listening have specific cases or counseling topics you want us to tackle in future deep dives, definitely send the suggestions our way. We want these to be useful for you.
Okay, so let's dive into today's case. It's Case Study 009, Carlos, the man with many masks.
All right, so Carlos. He's a 38-year-old Latino male, and he's been court-ordered into a 26-week domestic violence offender group. This happened after a domestic battery charge involving his partner.
And his initial presentation? Well, he was pretty guarded, tended to minimize the incident, saying things like, we were both yelling, that kind of thing, and definitely frustrated about being forced into therapy.
He did mention having trouble with anger before, verbal outbursts, punching walls sometimes when he gets overwhelmed. He denies a pattern of physical abuse, but admits to, quote, losing control sometimes.
He also described himself as not the emotional type. Said he grew up in a family where feelings just weren't really discussed.
And looking at his history, there's some relevant stuff. Frequent conflict between his parents, emotional abuse from his father. A previous relationship also ended because of similar anger issues, though no charges were filed then.
He also mentioned occasional binge drinking, but denies it's an addiction. Works in construction, doesn't seem to have a huge support system. He has a 10-year-old daughter he sees sometimes, and importantly, no prior therapy experience.
Okay, so that sets the stage for Carlos. First up, let's dig into the ethical considerations here. This is a big one for the NCE, especially with mandated clients.
Absolutely, because it's court-mandated, informed consent gets, well, complicated. You absolutely have to explain right up front the nature and purpose of the treatment. Why is he here? What are the goals?
And the big piece is confidentiality, right? It's not the same as voluntary therapy.
Not at all. You have to be crystal clear about the limits of confidentiality. Who are you reporting to? The court. Probation. What kind of information gets shared? Attendance. Progress. Lack of progress. He has the right to know all of that.
Yeah, outlining his rights within that mandated structure is still key ethically.
And that ties into the whole mandated versus voluntary client dynamic. Our default is non-judgmental, right? But here, you have to balance creating a safe space with holding him accountable for the abuse.
It's a tough line to walk.
It really is. You need that alliance, but you also have an ethical duty to address the behavior. Sometimes focusing on the choices he does have within the program, like how much he engages, can help with that initial resistance.
Okay, and then there's a cultural piece. Carlos is Latino. How does that factor in ethically?
Huge factor. We need multicultural sensitivity. Cultural norms around masculinity, expressing emotions, power dynamics. These can all influence how Carlos sees the situation and interacts in therapy.
Like him saying he's not the emotional type. That could be tied to cultural expectations.
It could be. Doesn't excuse the violence, of course, but it's vital context. We need cultural humility, recognizing our own biases and being open to understanding his perspective without judgment while still addressing the harm. His resistance might not just be defiance, it could be feeling misunderstood.
Makes sense. And finally, the legal and safety stuff. Documentation.
Critical, thorough, accurate notes on attendance, participation, progress, challenges. It's essential for the court and for tracking change. You need to communicate with probation or the court as required.
And the duty to warn.
Always paramount. If any new threats of harm come up to his partner, daughter, anyone's safety trumps confidentiality, you have to act. It's that constant ethical tension.
Okay, let's shift gears. Section 2, assessment and diagnosis. What tools might we use with Carlos?
Well, for assessing risk, something like the propensity for abusiveness scale, the PAS, could give a standardized measure.
Okay.
An anger expression inventory would also be useful to see how he handles anger. And given the binge drinking mention, definitely a substance use screen like the AUVs-AT.
And beyond specific tools, the clinical interview itself is key, right?
Absolutely. You're looking for patterns, history and relationships, family background. Crucially, his level of accountability. Does he minimize or take ownership?
You also dig into the substance use details, family history of violence, and his core beliefs about violence and relationships.
Right. Now, diagnosis. This is a really important point for the NCE. With court-mandated DV cases, a formal DSM-5-TR mental disorder diagnosis isn't always the main thing.
Why is that?
The court's often more focused on the specific behavior, the violence, and whether the person is addressing that.
But the DSM has a way to note that, doesn't it? The V codes.
Exactly. Other conditions that may be a focus of clinical attention. For Carlos, the most likely one would be spouse or partner violence perpetrator. It flags the reason for treatment without necessarily assigning a full disorder.
So it tells clinicians and potentially the court, this is what we're working on, even if he doesn't meet criteria for, say, PTSD or major depression.
Precisely. Now, you'd still assess for comorbid conditions, maybe intermittent explosive disorder given the anger, perhaps a mild alcohol use disorder, maybe an adjustment disorder related to the legal stress.
But only if he meets the full criteria.
Only if he meets the criteria. The main takeaway for the exam is that in these cases, behavioral accountability is often the primary goal, distinct from just finding a mental health label.
Got it. Okay, section 3, theoretical approaches. What models guide this kind of work?
Well, one you absolutely need to know for the NCE in this context is the Duluth Model.
Right, that's very common in DV offender programs. It's psychoeducational.
Primarily, yes. Its core focus is on power and control. It sees abuse not just as losing control, but as a choice made to maintain dominance in the relationship.
So it directly challenges the beliefs that support abuse and emphasizes accountability.
Exactly. It moves beyond just anger management to look at the whole system of control.
Okay, what else? CBT comes up a lot.
Cognitive behavioral therapy, yes.
Yeah.
Highly relevant. The thinking here is that abusive behavior is often linked to, well, cognitive distortions, those unhelpful thought patterns, and poor impulse control or anger management skills.
So CBT helps identify and challenge thoughts like, she deserved it, or it wasn't that bad.
Right. And it gives practical skills, ways to manage anger, better coping strategies, challenging those automatic negative thoughts that lead to outbursts. Focuses on the here and now.
And what about his resistance? He was pretty guarded initially.
That's where motivational interviewing, or MI, comes in. It's super valuable, especially early on with mandated clients who might not want to be there.
How does MI work in this context?
It's collaborative, client-centered. Instead of confronting him head-on, you explore his ambivalence about changing. You use reflective listening, open questions.
Trying to draw out his reasons for change?
Exactly. Enhance his intrinsic motivation. Help him see the discrepancy between his values and his actions. It's often much more effective than just pushing against the resistance.
Okay, that makes sense. So Section 4, interventions. Putting these theories into practice. What happens in the early phase of group therapy for someone like Carlos?
First thing, establish really clear group norms. Super important for safety and structure. Things like no blaming others, understand the limits of confidentiality in the group, mutual respect. Non-negotiables.
And you mentioned the Duluth Model. Is that where the power and control wheel comes in?
Yes, absolutely. Introducing that wheel early on is a powerful intervention. It helps guys like Carlos see that abuse isn't just physical hitting. It includes intimidation, emotional abuse, economic control, isolation. It broadens their definition.
Kind of an eye-opener if they've been minimizing.
Definitely. And alongside that, you're using those MI techniques we talked about, gently exploring his resistance, reflecting back what he says, showing empathy while still holding the focus on the behavior, building that foundation for engagement.
Okay, then moving into the middle phase, what interventions become more central?
That's where you really lean into the CBT-based anger management strategies, teaching specific techniques like thought stopping, identifying personal anger triggers.
What sets him off?
Right. And really connecting the dots between his actions and their consequences for his partner, his daughter, himself.
And challenging those cognitive distortions directly.
Yes. When he says, she made me hit the wall, you challenge that externalization. What choices did you have? How else could you have responded? Helping him dissect the thought process and take ownership.
What about things like real men don't cry?
You challenge that too. Explore where that belief comes from, how it limits him, and encourage healthier ideas about masculinity and expressing emotion.
Homework assignments too, right?
Definitely. Structured homework is key. Maybe tracking times he felt angry, but use a nonviolent response, or keeping an emotion log. What did he feel? How intense was it? What did he do? Build self-awareness.
And psychoeducation continues throughout.
Oh, yeah. Covering things like the cycle of violence, tension building, explosion, honeymoon phase, talking about societal influences, gender roles, the importance of emotional regulation, taking responsibility, and really hammering home the impact of abuse on partners and kids.
How do you know if Carlos is actually making progress? What are the signs?
You look for shifts. Is he taking more responsibility, less blaming? Can he actually identify his own distorted thoughts or risky patterns before acting? Is he demonstrating nonviolent communication in group, even in role plays? Is he doing the homework, participating thoughtfully? Those are good indicators.
Okay, great. So let's boil this down. Section 5, key takeaways for the NCE. What are the absolute must-knows from this case?
Number 1, ethics with mandated clients. Know the rules around informed consent, especially confidentiality limits, and your documentation duties. That's huge.
Number 2, know the key theories for DV offenders. Duluth Model, power and control, accountability. CBT, cognitive distortions, anger management skills.
3, motivational interviewing. Recognize its value for engaging resistant clients. Know the basic principles.
4, cultural sensitivity. Always consider how culture impacts the client's experience and your approach. Cultural humility is key.
And 5, the distinction between treating the behavior like DV perpetration, often using V codes, and diagnosing a formal mental disorder. Understand how that affects treatment planning and legal reporting.
Excellent summary. Okay, time for Section 6. NCE-style review questions. Ready?
Let's do it.
Question 1. What ethical issue is most relevant when working with a mandated DV offender like Carlos? A, ensuring full client autonomy. B, guaranteeing confidentiality at all times. C, clarifying limits of confidentiality due to court involvement. D, avoiding discussions about the abuse to prevent resistance.
Okay, the most relevant ethical issue here. Got to be C.
Right. C, clarifying limits of confidentiality due to court involvement. Because it's mandated, confidentiality isn't absolute, like in voluntary therapy. He needs to know what gets reported. Autonomy, A, is limited. Full confidentiality, B, isn't possible. And avoiding the issue, D, is unethical.
Question 2. What is the appropriate DSM-5-TR code when no mental disorder is diagnosed, but DV behavior is the focus of treatment? A, antisocial personality disorder. B, adjustment disorder with disturbance of conduct. C, spouse or partner violence, perpetrator, V code. D, conduct disorder.
We talked about this one. It's the V code, right?
Yep. The answer is C, spouse or partner violence perpetrator, V code. It specifically flags the behavioral issue as the reason for clinical attention when a formal disorder isn't the primary diagnosis or isn't present. The others are specific diagnoses with their own criteria.
Question 3. Which intervention model is most commonly used in domestic violence offender treatment programs? A, Gestalt therapy, B, Duluth Model, C, family systems therapy, D, existential therapy.
This one should be straightforward if you're studying DV treatment.
It's B, Duluth Model. Its focus on power, control, and accountability makes it the standard in this specific field, much more so than the other options listed.
Question 4. Carlos says, she made me hit the wall, she was pushing my buttons.
Right.
What is the best intervention? A, validate his frustration. B, redirect focus to her role in the conflict. C, challenge the cognitive distortion using CBT techniques. D, change the subject to reduce resistance.
He's blaming her, so you need to...
Challenge that thinking. The answer is C, challenge the cognitive distortion using CBT techniques. That statement is a classic externalization of blame. CBT directly addresses that kind of thinking to promote responsibility. Validating A, or focusing on her, B, reinforces his avoidance of accountability. Changing the subject, D, is unhelpful.
Question 5. Which group counseling principle is essential in a court-mandated DV offender group? A, catharsis. B, universality. C, structured accountability and ground rules. D, free expression of emotions without limits.
For this specific type of group, safety and structure are paramount.
Right. So it's C, structured accountability and ground rules. While other group factors might emerge, the need for clear rules, boundaries, and a focus on accountability is non-negotiable in a DV offender group. Unchecked emotional expression, D, could even be harmful.
Question 6. Which theoretical approach is most effective for increasing motivation in resistant clients like Carlos? A, rational emotive behavior therapy. B, motivational interviewing. C, psychoanalysis. D, solution-focused therapy.
We specifically linked one approach to resistance.
Exactly. B, motivational interviewing. It's designed precisely for exploring ambivalence and building that internal drive to change, which is crucial when someone doesn't initially want to be in therapy.
Question 7. A counselor's culturally competent approach with Carlos might involve A, assuming his resistance is due to his ethnicity. B, ignoring cultural influences to stay neutral. C, exploring how cultural beliefs about masculinity affect emotional expression. D, advising him to change his values.
Cultural competence means understanding, not assuming or ignoring.
So it's C, exploring how cultural beliefs about masculinity affect emotional expression. This shows respect and seeks understanding without stereotyping. A, ignoring culture. B, or imposing values. D.
Question 8. Which of the following is an example of a power and control behavior versus healthy conflict? A, walking away from an argument to cool down. B, using silence to avoid escalation. C, demanding passwords to control partner's social media. D, asking for a timeout during conflict.
Which one is about control, not just conflict management?
Yeah, C, demanding passwords to control partner's social media. That's about violating privacy and exerting control. The others, A, B, D, are generally seen as acceptable or even healthy ways to manage conflict escalation.
Question 9. Which of the following outcomes would indicate meaningful progress in Carlos's case? A, claiming he is not as bad as others in the group. B, blaming his partner less but not accepting responsibility. C, admitting his behavior was abusive and learning new ways to manage anger. D, finishing the group without attending sessions regularly.
What shows real change?
It has to be C. Admitting his behavior was abusive and learning new ways to manage anger. That combines accountability, admitting, with behavioral change, learning new skills. Comparing himself to others. A, reducing blame without taking responsibility. B, or just finishing without engaging. D, don't indicate real progress.
Question 10. What is a key ethical consideration in documenting court-mandated treatment? A, avoiding any mention of behavior to protect client privacy. B, using general language to protect the client. C, clearly documenting attendance, participation, and progress. D, only reporting when violence escalates.
What's the ethical requirement for notes in this context?
It's C. Clearly documenting attendance, participation, and progress. You have an ethical and often legal duty to provide clear, accurate information to the mandating authority. Vague notes, B, omitting behavior, A, or only reporting escalation, D, likely wouldn't meet those requirements.
Ooh, okay. That wraps up our NCE questions and this deep dive into case study 009. Hopefully breaking down Carlos's case has made some of these NCE concepts feel more concrete.
Yeah, the ethics, the theories like Duluth and CBT, using MI, cultural factors, it all comes together in these scenarios.
Definitely revisit these points. Maybe even look up that power and control wheel if you haven't seen it before.
And just one last plug for Glenn's weekly study group. If you want to connect with others studying for the NCE, shoot an email to inceststudyguide@gmail.com.
Good reminder. And do let us know if there are other topics you'd like us to cover. Your input helps us make these useful.
So maybe a final thought to leave folks with. How do you balance advocating for a client's needs, their individual struggles, within the very real constraints of a court-mandated program like this?
Ooh, that's a good one. That tension between the individual and the system. Definitely something worth mulling over as you prepare. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.
1, 2, 3.
Nice to be in orbit.